So far this week, we've spent time talking about cascading style sheets and how to embed them into an HTML document in a way that will allow you to assign rules, formatting, and rendering for certain parts of the document. We've talked about selectors, and in our code that we've used as example code, we've created a selector with the H1, which basically meant that anywhere where that H1 element showed up in a tag within the document, these rules that we applied through our style sheet should apply. We also talked about a special selector with a pound sign or a hash symbol at the beginning of it. In the case of our code, it was hash symbol contact. And all that word contact was an arbitrary word we basically made up. It said somewhere in the code we will probably have an element, an actual tag that's identified that way. In our code, we actually identified the P tag that included the proprietary information within it as the contact ID. And we said we're going to want the web browsers that see this information to render it in a certain way by providing style rules. So again, with the H1 tag, we provide the style rule saying that the text should be aligned to the center, and this made the text that was within those elements, those H1 on and off, centered. And then for the elements that had the ID contact, we said let's align those to the right, and so it took all that text and aligned it to the right. Now what we've learned so far is that we can take and apply rules to specific tags, to content that's within a start and end tag within your HTML. Now there may be times when you want to take a rule and apply it to a broader portion of your page. And we can do that with the div tag that we're going to introduce in today's exercise. First thing we're going to do is follow step 1 in your instructions on page 56, and we're going to put our cursor at the end of the body tag, and body on tag toward the beginning of the document, and we are going to then type 4 spaces and type div, since we're dealing with a div tag, and we're going to put a specific ID in there that should look familiar to you, and then we're going to stop there. At the bottom of the document, just after the last P tag, before the body tag, we're going to press enter, and we're going to go in 4 times, and we are going to put a closing div tag. It should look really familiar to you. An opening tag and a closing tag. And everything within that tag set is part of this div. You should also see some familiarity with this whole ID concept. We're actually given an identifier to the div tag, and it's going to be identified as box. Remember, these IDs that we're giving are not predefined. We could have called it square, we could have called it rectangle, we could have called it big box. We just happen to call it box. Since we added this new div tag, we have a whole series of other tags that now are component parts of the bigger div container. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of those component parts between the div on and the div off and add a little indentation to each of those parts. I'm just going to add 2 spaces, and keep in mind, I've said this several times before, and I'll say it once again, the spaces themselves don't change the function of anything within the code. All they do is help to make it a little more readable. In fact, if you look at it now, you'll see that between the div on tag right here and the div off tag right here, everything else is indented. And again, that's just for clarity. You can very easily see what's within that div. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go up to the actual style rules, and just after the last style rule closes with the curly brace, we're going to add a new one. We're going to go 6 in, and we're going to put pound box, and you notice now that lines up with the H1 selector and the contact selector. They're all very readable here. Then we're going to add an opening curly brace, and I'm going to go down to the next line, indent just a little more, and we're going to add the text the book has asked us to, border width as the name, 0.25 EM as the value. And then we'll add a semicolon at the end saying we're done with this name value pair. And then I'm going to go 8 in again, and I'm going to add a closing curly brace. So at this point, what we've done is we've added another selector. It should look pretty familiar to you now how these selectors are formatted. There's a selector name, a curly brace, the actual rule we're applying to the selector, and then another curly brace to say we're done with this particular selector. At this point, we're going to continue on and add the rest of the style rules that are specified in your book on figure C6, page 57. So the next style rule, and we're going to indent all of these at the same level, is border style. And the value for that will be solid. In some cases, it will be dashed or some other distinction to say what border should look like. The first one was the width of the border, how heavy it is. The third one on this list is border color. It should be fairly self-explanatory, especially when we put a color value in there of black. And then we are going to put in an attribute of width with a value of 50 EM. And EM is just a measure, and we'll talk more about exactly what that measure means. You can experiment with it in the meantime. Your book discusses it a little bit, and as the semester goes on, you'll have a better understanding of what this all means. Margin left, auto. Whenever you say auto as the value, you're usually telling the browser to do what it thinks is best, basically, in that case. Margin right, that's also going to be set to auto. Notice on the end of each line I am putting a semicolon to say I'm done with that name value pair. And the last one is padding, 1 EM. Okay, we should be all set here. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then I'm going to go back to my browser and I'm going to reload and we'll see what happens. Okay. And so basically you can see that we have been able to take the whole content that was in the body of the HTML and surround it by a box that was specified by the style sheet. I'm going to go back to that style sheet and just show you what would happen if maybe we change the color, because that will be very quick to see. From black to green, save the file, then we'll reload the page, and if all goes well, the border then becomes green around the edge of the box. So just as we change the green border, we'll go back and make one other change and see what happens. We'll take the border width and move it from 25 EM to, let's just say, 75. So we'll make it 3 times as large. We'll save, go back to the page, and watch what happens to the border at this point. Is much thicker than it was. Now, just to keep your code in line with mine, I'm going to move mine back to 25 EM for the border width, and I'm going to change the border color to black, as the book specifies. We'll save it one more time, go back to the page in the browser, and reload it. And this is what your page should look like, much like what you see in your textbook on page 57, figure C7. You've now completed the exercise on page 56 and 57. You're now ready to move on to the next one. Great job.